and this is definitely something different. For those of you who were at my Limud Together talk, the online talk about, I don't know how long ago it was, a few weeks ago, I'm going to cover some of the same material. I'm also going to try and update and make it not quite the same, but I think some of the background stuff is important. And I want to also try and leave some time for a bit of a discussion. I find with these Zoom talks, it can be a bit strangely isolating, even though everybody's there listening and talking. And one thing I wanted to do at the beginning was just to ask if there was anyone who had any particular topics, and I don't want comments, I just want sort of, you know, a few words of what you were hoping to hear about tonight, and I can try and cover them. So can we just unmute people, and I'll in fact I'll do that now, and if you just want to shout out, I'll take a few notes.
I was hoping to hear something about the sort of trade-off between the various rights under the convention and a sort of public policy, you know, when you have to do things for the good of the nation approach, and how traditionally case law and judges have balanced those, the individual freedoms with the public need.
Yeah. Great topic. Anyone else?
I'd like to hear your views on centralised contact tracing applications versus decentralised and data protection.
Yeah. Anyone else? Just take a third. Okay, good. I mean, is no one wondering when we can have minions again? Because from tomorrow we're up to 6 outdoors, so we're not far off. Actually, we really aren't far off. But I'll talk about that a bit later. Okay, great.
I've got one different question.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry, whether you think the issue of whether people who test positive will need to actually do forced isolation, will we get to that situation similar to laws which previously were brought in for other contagious diseases?
Okay, great. Those are all great questions, and I'll definitely cover them all. I'm just going to share my screen with you.
Mute everyone. Mute everyone. Mute everyone.
And I'll mute everybody as got that. Okay. Let's see if this works. Can you all see that? Thumbs up. Great. So I'm just going to give a sort of brief introduction to the human rights ideas that I'll be talking about, because it's always important for me to start somewhere near the beginning rather than in the middle. And the reason for that, especially with Jewish groups, I find, is that people have quite divergent ideas of what human rights are and what human rights mean. So I'll do a bit of an introduction, then mention 4 key human rights issues, and then we'll have a bit of a time for discussion. And if you want to type questions in the box to remember them, you're very welcome to in the discussion panel. So starting with the origins of the human rights movement, you can see there 4 leading lights of the human rights movement, and I've chosen them deliberately because the first one you'll all know is Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was absolutely central to the 1945 to 1951 human rights revolution in the modern terms. He gave a lot of speeches. He formed the Council of Europe, essentially, and in the Treaty of London, which is what formed the Council of Europe, which led to the European Convention on Human Rights. He talked about he dreamt of the enthronement of human rights, which I think is a really interesting way of thinking about rights. The second person you can see there is Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of the drafting committee. She was obviously the wife of the US president, but she was also the chair of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights drafting committee. So she was of fundamental importance to the Universal Declaration. Next to her is René Cassin, who you may have heard of being a great sort of Jewish human rights hero. He was a French jurist who was also extremely important for the drafting of the Universal Declaration, and a lot of the theory behind the Universal Declaration comes from René Cassin. And then the fourth person is David Maxwell Fyfe, who was a British Tory who was went on to become the Home Secretary, quite a sort of fire and brimstone Home Secretary. But he prosecuted at Nuremberg. He was the deputy prosecutor for the British team. You can watch him on YouTube cross-examining Hermann Goering. It's quite a sort of famous cross-examination. And there's some brilliant videos on YouTube actually of him. But he was the chair of the drafting committee for the European Convention on Human Rights. And the common thread for all of them, and in fact the common thread for everybody who was involved in the creation of the Universal Declaration, the creation of the European Convention, was that they lived through the most extraordinarily tumultuous and in many ways horrifying 25 years or so of of the first half of the 20th century. So human rights rest on three revolutionary principles. The first one is that all humans have the same rights. And that may sounds almost trite now, and we talk about it all the time, but before 1945, there have been many rights instruments really similar to the kinds of rights that we see in the modern human rights instruments. The the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, the American Bill of Rights, all from the 18th century. And we can go back even to sources like the Torah or the Babylonian scripts to see versions of rights instruments. But there was nothing like the idea that all humans have the same rights. They were always either reserved for men or reserved for a certain national group or reserved for a certain religion. They were not all the same for all humans. So that kind of equality of access is new. Rights were based on this idea of dignity. Dignity is in the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's an essential concept. It's kind of almost the base concept of all of the human rights we have. And this goes back to what Churchill said, the idea of enthronement of human rights, that rights, not rulers, would be at the heart of every society. And this was very much in the time of the fascists, in the time of the communists, in the time of the cult of the leader. And the idea was for the democratic, liberal states who succeeded in the Second World War, they would put these rights at the center of society. I should pause for a second. I was going to say this at the beginning, but there is it's bedtime in my house at the moment, so you may hear some noises from upstairs as my wife very kindly tries to get the little horrors to bed. So I'm just going to take you through a few key dates. The first one is 1945, and that's the establishment of the United Nations. The United Nations was a sequel in a way to the League of Nations, but it was another attempt to create a kind of world, if not a world government, then an association of aligned interests where countries could come, where states could come and sort out their differences and create a sort of modern, shared framework of values and of principles, a shared moral community. And that's why arising from the United Nations was the Universal Declaration and other really important world bodies. So from the Charter of the United Nations, the preamble, the idea was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women of nations large and small, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. So there was a kind of reactive focus, and there was a proactive focus. And the reactive focus was to try and stop what had just happened twice in 25 years, these world wars, these cataclysmic wars, which it was widely understood that humanity probably wouldn't survive a third world war, probably still wouldn't survive a third world war. So that was right in the minds of the United Nations, how to protect succeeding generations from the scourge of war. But also there was a proactive project, which was to promote social progress, better standards of life in larger freedom. And it was to do what hadn't happened in the fascist states and what was understood not to be happening elsewhere in totalitarian societies. 1948, before I started talking about human rights in the context of COVID-19, I never included the World Health Organization in my sort of setup for human rights talks. And now I'm never now going to leave it out because the World Health Organization is fundamentally a human rights organization set up by the United Nations and designed for a very specific purpose that I think we've sort of in certain parts of the world forgotten about, and which makes it all the more dangerous to sort of start defunding it or stopping it doing its work. This should be a reaffirmation of its importance. And we can see, if you read the Constitution, which to my shame I'd never read until very recently, it's all there for us to, it's all there for us to understand and to appreciate. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights in every human being, without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic or social condition. And there you see the inextricable linkage of human rights and a decent standard of health. And it's obvious, if you think about it, without a decent standard of health, there's not much point having a right to free speech or a right not to be unlawfully detained because you'll be ill or dying. There really isn't much point. And then this third part, which I think is spot on, the health of all people is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security. So it's that link to those reactive and, it's a link to the reactive aims of the United Nations, that without healthy peoples, you can't attain peace and security. And we can now see how even a pandemic, which in the grand scheme of things, compare it to previous pandemics, the Black Death, the Spanish flu, is not as deadly. It still causes the most extraordinary insecurity in even very stable societies. Health is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security. The achievement of any state is in the promotion and protection of health is of value to all, should be self-evident. And unequal development in different countries in the promotion of health and the control of disease, especially communicable disease, is of common danger. And again, something which, if you're not in the world public health scene, you might have let this one slide, but we shouldn't have. 1948, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's Eleanor Roosevelt holding her baby. And this is a set of basic rights which should be aimed at and certainly have not been achieved for all of humanity and by every state. And this is not from the Universal Declaration. This is from a speech that Eleanor Roosevelt gave about a decade later, where after all the universal human rights begin, in small places close to home, so close and so small they cannot be seen on any maps of the world, yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. And that, for me, is, again, of huge importance, that human rights are not something which exist in the ether. They don't just exist in laws. They don't just exist in elite minds. They are there in the small places. They're about how we treat each other on a day-to-day basis. And I think from a religious perspective, that is something which really should be self-evident, that's what sort of law-based religion is about. It's about bringing these big moral principles down into the home and then back up. 1948, the Genocide Convention. So this is around the same time as the Universal Declaration. I think it was a week before or a week after. I think it was a week after. the Genocide Convention, so outlawing for the first time genocide, which is a new concept. And if you want to read about that, East West Street by Philippe Sands is the place to go. This is all a package. 1951, the European Convention on Human Rights. So it's easy to get lost in all these different conventions and treaties. But the important thing to understand about the Universal Declaration is this set of rights wasn't binding on any particular country. It was a sort of an ideal situation that states should aim towards, but it wasn't necessarily enforceable. But then different regions of the world, such as the Americas and then the Europeans, came up with their own conventions, which were actual treaties, binding treaties on states. So in 1951, the Universal Declaration came into force. It's a set of simple rights. I'll go into the specific rights shortly. But the idea was that each state that signed up to it, and there you'll see the founding states, one of which was the UK, and I've never actually looked to see which signature is the UK, but it's there somewhere. Each state would be bound by these rights, so that if an individual, and this came a bit later, but not much later, if an individual felt their rights were being breached, they could go to the court, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and get a judgment in their favor. And the whole point of the treaty was that if you got a judgment in your favor, you would be, that the state had agreed to abide by the judgment. So they would, in theory, make it happen. So why then? And why in these extraordinary 5 years from 1946 onwards? Well, what had happened to these people, these individuals who were coming up with these ideas? Well, they'd had the First World War, they'd had the Spanish flu, which again is something which, unless you're a healthcare professional or a historian, had kind of become a footnote in history for many people. But now we look back and say, oh, right, that's what was happening. Up to something like 50 million people died in the Spanish flu. It was the most extraordinarily devastating pandemic, and it's left its mark, and you can see its mark on all of those human rights instruments and ideas, the World Health Organization, the fact that the European Convention itself has, and the Universal Declaration has, exceptions for when you can detain people for the purpose of preventing the spread of infectious diseases. This, along with other infectious diseases such as cholera, were clear and present dangers to both health and security. 1929, the Wall Street crash, leading to the Great Depression. And the Second World War is the one that I've left out, but obviously the Second World War and the Holocaust were hugely influential in the development of these ideas. And in fact, sometimes when I say that one of the best ways to understand the Universal Declaration is when you put it in the mirror and you say, well, what happens when your property is taken away? What happens when your right to family life is taken away? When you're unlawfully detained without the right to see a judge? When your right to privacy is taken away? Well, what happened when all those rights were taken away is what happened between 1933 and 1945 to the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe. That's why it's a kind of mirror image of the build-up to the Holocaust. And that's one of the reasons why human rights. So why human rights? They are there for when societies break down. And there was a very well-developed understanding in about 1945 of exactly what happens when societies break down, what it looks like. And that human rights, not just the principles, but the protections. So the protections in law, the protections in our institutions are there to prevent that kind of social breakdown. Global crises need global solutions. This is going back to when I spoke about that revolutionary concept of equality, that every person has the same rights all over the world. That there was an understanding from 1945 onwards that it was no longer enough for individual states or regions to protect their own, that you had to have a global set of principles that would be enforced. And it's a separate talk, but one I've given a number of times to the Jewish audiences. The Nuremberg trials were an example of world justice that had never really been tried before, based on completely new ideas of crimes against humanity, genocide, these sort of world crimes. And a globalized world needed globalized principles and globalized solutions. Human rights are a crisis toolkit. This is one of the most useful ways of understanding what human rights are, is they're not abstract principles, they are a toolkit to analyze your decision making when a crisis hits. And that's what we'll talk about in relation to COVID-19. And then finally, a shield and a sword. They're there to protect. So when marginalized, unpopular groups are picked upon, like they always are when societies break down, human rights laws should be there as a shield to prevent not just the worst happenings, the worst being genocide, but the internment of particular groups, the discrimination against particular groups. They're a shield, but they're also a sword, and this is that progressive project that I was talking about. So these are the rights, roughly speaking, in the European Convention on Human Rights, and they are. They're a bit more complicated than this in reality, but this is the basics. And I'm just going to highlight a few that come up potentially in relation to COVID-19. So the first and most obvious one, the right to life, sometimes called the most fundamental right for obvious reasons. Not that the other rights aren't much use if you're not alive. Or if you're under threat of death, because people generally focus on the threat of death before everything else. But this is the lodestar of a significant amount of the thinking over COVID-19 and human rights, is that fundamentally the state has a duty to protect life. And that can manifest itself in various ways. But the reason why it's probably okay from a human rights perspective, with all the balances you have to achieve, to effectively lock down societies and restrict almost all of the other rights, is because if you don't, many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people will die. But the balance is very tricky. The right not to be unlawfully detained. I mentioned earlier that in the ambit of human rights law, in the boundaries of human rights law, you can detain people to prevent the spread of an infectious disease. However, there have to be certain safeguards even so. It's also not completely clear how far that extends. So you can definitely detain people if they are suffering from an infectious disease. How far does that extend to somebody who has symptoms of an infectious disease? And something that's been troubling a lot of states is how does it extend to detaining people who aren't suffering from an infectious disease, but may be suffering from an infectious disease that doesn't manifest itself by way of symptoms for the first few days, such as COVID-19. And that is really tricky, and it's not clear what the answer is. Right to a fair trial. Almost all, I can speak from personal experience, almost all trials at the moment, both criminal and civil, have been either delayed or stopped. And in fact, they've been delayed. And the reason is that it's very difficult to have jury trials during a socially distanced, in a time when the government is only allowing certain work activities to happen with social distancing. And that's particularly difficult when you've got asking members of the public to volunteer their time. Some trials have gone online or by video or even by phone, but that gives rise to particular issues of, can the witnesses see the judge? Can the lawyers consult with their clients? It's a whole range of difficulties which would be bad enough if you had a couple of years to figure this all out, but the justice system has tried to get itself set up in a few weeks to work remotely, and it's very tricky. Family and private life, well, I probably don't need to tell you about this. The COVID-19, the lockdown, the shielding law, the shielding guidance, it's the prevention on travel has really fundamentally affected people's family and private life. People are unable to have weddings, bar mitzvahs, all of the above, funerals with people there. It's really, really onerous. Freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Well, again, I won't have to talk much about this because you already know there are no synagogues, mosques, temples, or churches in the whole country meeting at the moment. They haven't been for a couple of months, and that is unprecedented. I mean, unprecedented is not an exaggeration. I think it's fair to say that this has never happened in the history of this country. I don't think it happened during the Blitz. I don't think it happened at any time that you would have no religious community meetings at all in any denomination of any religion, except maybe in private, in people's houses in Stamford Hill, but who knows. Freedom of association, so protests. So we've starting to see this more and more, that there are people are trying to go out and demonstrate about various things. And it was a demonstration, there was a couple of demonstrations this weekend, one by Extinction Rebellion, one about the events that have been happening in the US, the race issues. And at the moment, they're not allowed because any gathering of over 2 people, not from the same household, is banned. And in fact, that's going to change tomorrow to 6 people, but it's not much of a protest. And that, as that balance is very difficult. I just use this Article 11 free association to explain how some of the rights work. So if you look at this and you divide it from Article 2 to 7, and then Article 8 to 11. So Article 2 to 7 are unqualified rights, and what that means is that they set basic standards, and the basic standards can never be, you can't go below the basic standards for any reason. There's no justification for going below those basic standards. So right to a fair trial, trials have to attain certain levels of openness, transparency. The individual has to have access to a lawyer, various other things, and that is there's no excuse for not having those things. Article 8 to 11, those are what's called qualified rights. So you inherently have a balance, and the way it works is that to take freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, you have a freedom to manifest your religious beliefs, and that might be through attending a synagogue on a weekly basis, however often. The state has the capability of interfering with that right. So, for example, on putting limits on the amount of people that can go to a synagogue, or even closing a synagogue down during an epidemic, but only if the interference is necessary, in accordance with the law. So it's got to be some legal basis for doing that, and proportionate. And proportionality is a key sort of human rights concept. And what it means is you shouldn't crack a nut with a hammer. So you should only do as much as is necessary and no more to achieve the aim that you're trying to achieve. So to take the example of the current situation, I mean, there's currently a legal challenge by a mosque in Birmingham that wanted to open up to socially distanced celebration of Eid at the end of Ramadan. And it's an undecided, it's not been decided yet, but they lost the first bit of it, which is the main bit, which is they were trying to get an injunction to allow them to open, and the court said no, because the balancing exercise clearly falls on the side of the government's argument, which is that the protection of health is more important than opening up all of, it would mean opening up every mosque and probably every church and synagogue in the UK in a socially distanced way. They just weren't ready for that. It wasn't the science didn't recommend it. It was a reasonable interference given the enormity of the crisis, even though it was causing very significant difficulties for believers. But that's how proportionality and the balancing exercise works. And that applies for freedom of information and free association as well. So freedom, you've also got anti-discrimination. So we've heard quite a bit about how COVID-19 doesn't affect everybody equally. The Black and minority ethnic communities and potentially Jewish communities too seem to suffer more for some reason from COVID-19, and that gives rise to potential discriminatory issues. Peaceful enjoyment of property, not a very large number of people have lost money or lost businesses because of the shutting down of a large part of the economy, and that gives rise to, again, a balancing exercise, but it is a protected right, but it can be interfered with for the protection of public health. And right to education is the other issue, which is just hugely important, that 10 million school-aged children have been unable to attend school for the last 2 months. And it's not clear how, it's not quite clear how the right to education impacts on that, but I'll talk a bit about that later. Okay, so 5 issues, and I'll try to do this in 10 minutes. I'm just going to touch on them. The lockdown, state responsibility for death, contact tracing, school shutdown, and international solidarity. So the lockdown, which you will all have been experiencing, this was a tweet relatively early in the lockdown, which I think of as the Yogi Bear tweet. If you think this is central beds police force, if you think by going for a picnic in a rural location, no one will find you, don't be surprised if an officer appears from the shadows. We're covering the whole county. I think slightly tongue-in-cheek, but there was a lot of this at the beginning of the lockdown. That the police were being a little bit trigger happy with with interpreting the lockdown regulations. Sending out drones to stop people going to beauty spots, doing roadblocks, searching people's shopping trolleys, stopping people buying Easter eggs, and that those. But to be fair to the police, this is unprecedented, the lockdown in peacetime, as I was saying just before we started. There really has been nothing like this, a set of laws which come in all of a sudden. I mean, literally one day they were not enforced and the next day they were, and nobody saw them before, and that's applied every time they've changed as well. And in fact, they changed at 2 o'clock this afternoon for tomorrow morning, and nobody had seen them, and they've really quite fundamentally changed again, and they happen, so they sort of appear out of nowhere, and they don't go through Parliament in the normal way. They get passed as emergency regulations, so that they don't even have to be put to a vote for 28 days. But this lockdown, for the last 2 months, you've not been allowed to leave the house except for specific reasonable excuses, and those reasonable excuses are a mixture of listed excuses and unlisted excuses. We've heard. I won't talk about Dominic Cummings, but this whole issue came out again over the last week or so because people were trying to gauge what a reasonable excuse was. Is it reasonable to go and go for a drive to test to see if you're all right to drive? As we got sort of strange situation from that story. But again, like this tweet, although you can see it as slightly sort of bizarre and almost comedic, it's really not funny when you're one of the 65 million people who are having to figure out what these regulations mean, how they impact on your daily life. Can you go and see your elderly parents? Can you go and visit a of somebody who's just had a baby? Can you go to a funeral? You know, all of these incredibly difficult situations at the same time as people are suffering from a infectious disease, their relatives are not well or they're dying. It's been, from a human rights perspective, cataclysmic in many ways. And whether it's been right or wrong from a legal perspective or from a overall moral perspective, it is almost the ultimate balance between what do we, how can we protect people who are vulnerable to this disease? How can we protect people's livelihoods at the same time? The government paying for everybody's work for 2 months or for 6 months, as it might end up being. It really is. These are extraordinary times, and they engage every single one of those rights that I showed you earlier. State responsibility for death is the second point I wanted to raise. This is going to come, I guess, a bit later in the coronavirus story, because one of the big innovations which has happened because of human rights law, and particularly, I haven't spoken about the Human Rights Act, but the Human Rights Act came into force in 2000, so 20 years ago. And one of the big changes to our civil society is the rise of the Expanded Inquest. An inquest is an investigation into a death. And under human rights law, where the state is arguably complicit in a death or responsible for it, then there has to be an extended, detailed investigation into the death. And that can take the form of a coroner's inquest, it can take the form of a public inquiry, but this is going to be a big part of the picking up the pieces from coronavirus, is all the investigations which are going to have to happen. And human rights laws requires that those investigations are have particular features. So they've got to be effective, they've got to be open, they've got to involve the relatives of the deceased, they've got to be independent. And that is quite different to what governments tend to want to happen in these kind of investigations. A third issue is contact tracing. We've not quite got started. There's been a few false starts, and I think that it's right to say that there's two kinds of contact tracing broadly. There's manual contact tracing, and there's digital contact tracing. Manual contact tracing is when a public health official, calls you up and finds out if you're potentially suffering from or have been positively confirmed as suffering from COVID-19. They call you up and say, who have you been in touch with in the last couple of weeks? And you tell them, and they call those people up and tell them that they may be infected and they should isolate for 2 weeks or until a week after the end of their symptoms. And that is extremely intrusive, you can imagine, because one of these 20,000 people that has apparently been recruited, sitting in a call center, calling you up, who did you have dinner with last week? How close did you sit to them? Did you touch? These are extraordinarily invasive questions, but for a good reason. And contact tracing works in societies which are set up to do it. Now, one of in one sense, less invasive way of doing contact tracing is through a mobile phone app. And there are a couple of different ways of doing that at the moment. Technologically, there's what have been described as a centralized app and a decentralized app. And a centralized app is I should start with what the app is. What the app does, you download it on your phone, and the phone uses your Bluetooth to bump up against anybody that you are close to with the Bluetooth. So anybody you're close to, say within 2 meters, the Bluetooth will register that they have been close to you. And if you're close to them for more than 5 minutes, they'll register you've been particularly close to that person. And they'll convert that into a kind of risk assessment. So, and then if one person out of the two registers that they have been diagnosed with COVID-19 or are suffering from COVID-19 type symptoms, the app will alert either, and this is the centralized bit, either by sending the information up to a centralized server, where that centralized server will then know all the different people you've been in close contact with in the infectious period, and will then beam down a warning to those people, but will also keep that data in the cloud so that the NHS can do a sort of wider analysis of the data, look for hotspots, look for patterns. So either the centralized data, it goes up, or the decentralized approach, it just pings across to the other phone, and that will then ping across to all the phones that you've been in contact with in the last couple of weeks. But the data stays on your phone, the data stays on their phone, and then it gets deleted. So you just get the warning, but you don't have the opportunity to analyze the central data. And this gives rise to very significant privacy issues, particularly if you're storing lots and lots of data centrally that's potentially identifiable to you. Now, there's ways of anonymizing it, but it's possible that along with other data sets, such as your Google Maps data, it might be able to identify you, and that does give rise to privacy issues, particularly as the NHS hasn't got a great record, neither has this government, of keeping data sets like that private. I'm working at the moment, I didn't mention at the beginning, with the Joint Committee on Human Rights in Parliament as their special advisor for the COVID-19 inquiry that they're undertaking. So they're looking at all of the government's response to COVID-19. And one of the things we've been doing is we've drafted a bill that's been published, which is it's called the Digital Contact Tracing Data Protection Bill, and it's an attempt to nail down some of the promises by the government in law to protect privacy. And the Joint Committee has taken evidence, and in fact, it's Matthew Gould, who you might know as the former British ambassador to Israel, is leading the NHSX development of this app. Interestingly, fourth issue is the right to education. Just to mention a case that I've been involved in recently, which was about access to online education. So one of the problems at the moment, obviously the main problem, is kids can't go to school. But most kids, apart from the kids of key workers, but even the kids of key workers, a lot of them aren't going to school, and the vulnerable children, defined as vulnerable, who are meant to be going to school, I think 95% of them aren't. So pretty much nobody's going to school. There are these online classes, and particularly for older kids, they're really important to keep the education going. But unfortunately, the online stuff is only available if you've got devices at home that are capable of reading it and of engaging with it. And a lot of families don't have any online devices, or they'll only have one, and it's a pay-as-you-go phone that's shared between the family. Maybe there's 3 or 4 kids, maybe they all need to access this stuff. So I've been working on a case using this right to education, and the right to education is usually used when education is being provided in a discriminatory way, and in one sense it is, because of the shift to online education. It's exacerbating existing inequalities, because the kids who are already behind, because they're from difficult family backgrounds, they might not have access to resources, they're falling further behind, and it's really tricky. And actually the government, after we launched this case, announced I think £80 million scheme to provide laptops and tablets to kids and internet connections to kids who need them, but it's still a huge problem. The final point is that I wanted to raise was, if you remember, I started towards the beginning by saying that the whole idea behind modern human rights is that global problems needed global solutions. And you saw in the World Health Organization constitution that that a threat to health in a particular country is a threat to security for all. You just see, whether it's because 1 million refugees suddenly appear at the border because they can't get access to healthcare, or they're terrified of an infectious disease spreading, or because there's internal political strife in the country because of the way the government's handled it, or riots. Human rights is about international solidarity. And in fact, during these kind of crises, I think we tend to bunker in and forget about what's happening elsewhere, except to compare ourselves in a sort of macabre way. But as this virus spreads to parts of the developing world, there's potentially going to be absolutely disastrous effects that far overshadow what's happened in the sort of rich countries. You know, countries like Sierra Leone, which last I heard had 1 ventilator in the entire country, or Gaza, which I think last I heard has 7. Refugee camps where there's just tens of thousands of people, where the idea of social isolation is a joke, because the people are packed in to tight living quarters with in tents. These are, once we've dealt with our first wave of this disease, this is where we need to look to, because of the principles that I was just talking about. So summing up, all humans have rights, a crucial toolkit, dignity and flourishing, absolutely central to human rights, a shield and a sword. Let's have a discussion. And in fact, I'm going to put this slide up so you can see. I run a podcast called the Better Human Podcast, which is which has all this stuff every week, doing lots of COVID-19 stuff, and that's me on Twitter, and that's the organisation I set up. And I'm going to unshare the screen and open up to questions. So I'm not entirely sure the best way of doing it. Should I just unmute everybody? I've unmuted it. No, I haven't unmuted everybody.
Leave everyone. Let's leave everyone unmuted.
I've unmuted everybody. So do you want to just jump in?
Cool.
Wave. If you wave, I'm watching for wavers.
Okay.
So Keith Mount is the first.
Yes, hello. Hello, I'd like to ask about the human rights of the people in care homes. So when they were the government seemed to neglect the elderly people that were in care homes right at the beginning, and I just wonder whether you know, how that fits in with what you've been talking about.
Hangs up on there, he probably didn't realise.
Shall I take a couple of questions and then we'll should we do one more?
Yeah, go on, Robert. Robert's got your hand up there.
Adam, there are certain countries where, for example, if you don't agree to a measles vaccination, you can't go to school. You can see there the balance of an individual right set against a social right for the wider community. But I can't quite see here where we haven't got any proven benefit for many of the measures that have been taken by the central government, what the basis, either in law or in rights, that the government has to have a lockdown, for example, given that there isn't proof that actually that will be of social or individual benefit.
Okay, 2 great questions. Care homes, I mean, I haven't mentioned care homes, and I should have done, because what's happened in care homes seems like a huge scandal. There've been a massive locus of COVID-19 deaths, and obviously the people in care homes are the most vulnerable groups, and they should have been front and center in who we were going to protect. Now, it may be that when this is all looked at afterwards, there were obvious mistakes made. Maybe there were non-obvious mistakes made in the early days. Those are human rights issues. The human rights issues, first of all, because of the non-discrimination requirement in human rights-based policy, that you can't forget about a group because they're particularly old, and maybe you don't. You have a sort of hard-nosed economic approach to your prioritization. You can't do that in a human rights-based policy framework. But also the people in care homes who are being looked after in large part by the state, you know, and I think the vast majority of care homes are in some way state funded, even if they're run by private corporations. The state has a duty to protect those people from inhuman treatment, and also from the real and immediate risk of dying. But in a way, another way of looking at it, it kind of almost goes beyond the certainly human rights laws. And I think that the government will have to account, in whether it's in a public inquiry or inquests, for the way it's handled care homes. But I think also individual care home providers will have to account how they've handled that. The question about forced vaccinations and proof, scientific proof of various things, I think this is so the way it plugs into the human rights approach is that it's that balancing exercise of having to, on the one hand, if you've got a legitimate aim, which, and obviously protecting life is a legitimate aim, you have to balancing it against all the other rights you're going to have to restrict if you say lockdown or do other things like, I mean, for example, immunity passports is something the government is apparently considering. And what that means is if you've had an immunity, if you've taken a test that shows you've had COVID-19, then you may be allowed to go out and about, back to work or whatever, in a way that other people won't, because you potentially will be less of a risk of passing on the disease, of catching the disease. But the problem with all of these things is the science is really up in the air. You know, it's a brand new. Although it seems like a million years, this virus has only really been known about for 6 months. So it's the very early days of us understanding it. To be fair to the government, they can only deal the hand that they can only play the hand they've been dealt, and the hand they've been dealt is shaky science. And I think every government in the world is dealing with that problem, is that they've got to make decisions based on rough science, on early raw science, on different scientists who have different ideas about what there is. And we've seen that with the arguments over SAGE, their advisory group over the Imperial study, which was the foundation of the original lockdown. This study which said that if you don't lock down, there'll be 500,000 deaths. But my feeling, and this is sort of outside of my expertise, I sort of pull out at this stage, but my feeling is that on my basic understanding of what how the science is speaking at the moment, is that we will probably only know what the right answer was in retrospect, and I'm not sure it's clear what it is now. I don't think that's really a human rights answer in a way. It's just a sort of public policy answer, which means your guess is as good as mine, and Robert's guess is probably better than mine. Any other question?
Okay.
We've got Robin.
Thank you. Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
So, Adam, that was a lovely talk. Thank you. You said, and I wrote this down, about Article 2, the state has a duty to protect life. That was not relative. So my question is about herd immunity and Cheltenham Festival and Liverpool football matches and stereophonics and so forth. That led to death of a significant number of people, maybe 20, 30,000. Controversial. But if it's true, the state is responsible for mass murder.
Well, so the first thing I'd say is it's not going to be mass murder, because no one wanted it to happen, and so for it to be murder, you have to intend for it to be murder. You could have something like corporate manslaughter if you're grossly negligent in the way that you approach policy. But I think, being realistic, given I read that, again, this is slightly outside of my comfort zone, but what the scientists were saying at that time to the government was, on the one hand, if you lock down now, my understanding is you will suffer a bigger outbreak in the autumn or winter. You will be potentially, people will stop listening to you after a few weeks. All of these sort of basically theories, propositions that were unproven and untestable at the time. But you do look at other countries like South Korea, like Japan, like Israel, that locked down very, very quickly, and not many people died. But they may be having to go back into lockdowns over the next year and a half, and lockdowns have effects on society, deep and lasting effects on society as well. I think that the answer to that question is, I genuinely think we will know the answer to that at the end of this virus, if there is an end. I don't see how we can know the answer now, but I know that everybody will potentially reasonably disagree with that.
But the data is there in front of us. The number of deaths and the number of deaths per proportion of the population. We're a disaster in this country. We're a laughingstock across the world.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you.
And so we did something wrong, and somebody must be held accountable for that decision. You know, we heard a great talk at Limud about how Israel shut down. You're right to pick on Israel as one of many countries who got it right, and we got it disastrously wrong. And the evidence couldn't be more clear.
I can't disagree. But I'm more inclined to look in a year's time and see where we got to.
It's too late, Adam. Sorry, I'm a consultant and I'm dealing with this.
Well, then
I'm dealing with
definitely defer to you.
Second hand with what's going on, and it leads to the second question, which was about the inquests.
Yeah.
And who will be responsible when there wasn't enough oxygen to treat young people, and there weren't enough ventilators? We say there were enough ventilators, but there weren't in some hospitals. Who holds the responsibility then at those inquests?
Well, I think there's going to be an issue about whether those questions about procurement are dealt with at inquests. And I think the chief coroner has actually said he doesn't want individual coroners to look at national procurement questions. But I think naturally it's going to end up in a public inquiry looking at all those issues. It has to really, because it has to be looked at in the broad canvas. Obviously, there'll be individual questions for, say, particular care homes or particular hospitals, but I think ultimately it's going to be a question for a public inquiry. But the question is when is that the right time to have that public inquiry? Because we're still pretty early days, unfortunately.
Adam, I've got a lot of questions piling up here for you. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to use brotherly privilege to allow my sister to ask you a question. I think you need to unmute, Amanda.
Context who your sister is, maybe.
Sorry. His sister is Amanda Bowman, not a Muswell Hill member, but really enjoying your Sunday evening sessions. So I gate crash regularly. Adam, I'm interested if you could give us a tangible example. The poor old government. I mean, who would want to be in government at the moment? But they have had to make policy and law on the hoof, as you've explained. But can you give us an example of why it would be advisable for them to think about using a human rights framework to consider their decision making around COVID-19, and what the impact of that kind of decision would be and how it would differ? Because I appreciate it's really early days, but they have, they're weighing up the science, they're weighing up this, they're weighing up that. And I'm not suggesting that in any shape or form they're getting it right, but I'd just really like, you've given us, you've done a quick canter around it from a human rights framework, but if you could give some real examples of what the difference might be in the way they'd make decisions.
Well, I mean, to be fair to the government, they, in a number of ways, they are using a human rights framework, and we see the evidence of that. So, for example, if you look at the contact tracing app, and also contact tracing itself, because of the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the EU law, which is it's very much a right to privacy based approach to all holding of data and all processing of data, and all of the principles from it come through the human rights world, come through that framework. So in order to set up for the app, they have to do a particular kind of analysis called a data protection assessment or something, data protection impact assessment, which goes through the balancing exercise in exactly that way that I did, which is to say, what will be the impact on privacy? What's the aim? What is this the least intrusive way of achieving it? Are they going to, and actually there's certain sort of hard requirements, like you've got to have the right to have your data stopped being processed. You've got to have certain, a very open approach to, very transparent approach to consent. so that if you are consenting to that app, the law is you've got to set out, the government have got to set out what you're consenting to in a plain English way that can be understood by anybody, not just a lawyer. It can't just be 1,000 pages of data protection assessments, that sort of thing. I think another example is the requirement. So this is an example where I think the government have fallen down, but where they're failing on a requirement to look at things from a human rights perspective, and that's through these emergency regulations. So the lockdown regulations, the regulations that stop you leaving your house without a reasonable excuse, or from tomorrow stop you doing things inside your house with more than one person not from your household without a reasonable excuse, which is the new formulation of it. They are secondary legislation, which means that there's an act of parliament which allows for them to come in on an emergency basis, called the Public Health Prevention of Infectious Disease Act, I think it's called. And under that act, every time you use this emergency procedure, you've got to say, you've got to be clear in your own mind as the minister that the law itself, the regulations themselves, are proportionate. So that means doing that analysis, using all the different human rights, and testing, using this tool to test what you're doing. So, for example, if the law that you're creating is going to prevent unmarried, not just unmarried, people who are in relationships that don't live with each other, seeing each other or staying with each other, you have to analyze whether that is a legitimate and proportionate interference, which is obviously a huge interference in people's private and family life, to achieve the legitimate aim. But until today, none of the regulations have said that they are, the minister confirms that these are proportionate, and they haven't been doing a regular sort of open and transparent review of how these things are working. And one of the sort of work streams that I've been doing with the Joint Committee on Human Rights is trying to convince the government to, through a series of reports, to take that duty much more seriously, to publish the regulations in advance and to explain how they're working from a sort of balance perspective. And in fact, today, the new regulations were the first time where they've said, they've sort of certified them as being proportionate. They've obviously, they've heard a few of lawyers who have made this same point. But whether that means they've actually done the analysis rather than just saying, sort of, here's the box to tick, it remains to be seen. Put it like that. But those are just a couple of examples.
Thank you.
Okay. Assuming you're still happy to take a couple more questions, Adam.
Can I take some from the written questions?
I was just about to get you one of the written questions, which is Martin. I was gonna let him say it to you rather than me read it out, if that's okay.
I think it might be quicker if shall I just answer them? I'll ask them and answer them, because I think we're a bit over time already. I don't want to keep people from their dinner. How far can the state go if society breaks? When the rioting starts, the shooting starts. I mean, that's Donald Trump's tweet a couple of days ago. I mean, Donald Trump's not a paragon of the human rights approach to governance, put it like that. And I'm glad he's not here. You know, for all the criticism I have of our own leaders, I do find myself thinking, at least they're not Donald Trump. Hannah, what about the right to a safe work environment for medical staff, police, essential workers, footballers, etc.? Absolutely, this is one of the key. I mean, it's quite. I find it quite sort of ironic that health and safety law and human rights law are often held up, particularly by certain newspapers, as kind of joke laws that, you know, or another health and safety or human rights. You know, but we see now, you know, you see when the pardon my French, but when the shit hits the fan, you see why you need these protections, because individuals are potentially going to die because they're in an unsafe work environment. And it's not the people you expect normally, which is people working in sort of manual labor type situations, but bus drivers. You know, people talk a lot about care workers and NHS, people working in the NHS, and there's a huge issue there. But I've heard somewhere that bus and train drivers have died at more than 10 times the rate of other workers, because probably they've not been adequately protected. They've probably been forgotten about as compared to other professions. So those are hugely important issues. Judith, do you want to ask a question?
I'll just quickly add, I happened to bump into my dentist the other day, and he, like all dentists, are allowed to go back to practicing in a week's time. He said he's being given 0 protective gear. It's entirely up to him to get it. And it's a really dangerous contact he's going to have. So that was that. And then my quick question is, what I see as things open up is how will they ascertain what's fair and what's not fair? They'll say this particular kind of shop or social thing can go ahead, but some other one can't. And people could get very angry that it's an unfair on their human rights when somebody else is allowed to open up something they think is comparable. How will that all be sorted?
I mean, I heard one of my fellow lawyers who's been very involved in this sort of lockdown stuff wrote something at the last lot of regulation changes that it seems like it's almost like a sort of upper class British summer that you can now have. You can go to the car dealership, have a round of golf, play tennis, go to an open air market. You know, what about all the other things that people do? It's almost like Boris Johnson's day out. But it is, these are really serious questions, and I think that we've been almost we've not had to deal with these questions for the last couple of months because it's been pretty much equally bad for everybody. But now you're absolutely right, Judith, that as things start to open up, there is going to be, I imagine there'll be legally contested questions about why can open air markets open up but not open cafes, something like that. And there's a lot of money behind those questions, and they're really important questions for people's livelihoods. So, and then what happens when things start to shut again? Are they going to shut things in the same order that they reopen them? What's going to happen? So, and the science will change. Will they respond to the science? The courts up to now have totally have not interfered, and they were never going to interfere, but they might soon. I'll just take one more of the written questions. Mark Levison's, let me just read them. Yeah, I think the question or the comment that Mark makes about the fear that the authorities, if I paraphrase, the authorities will become used to having these kind of powers. I don't think you have to be cynical or paranoid to think that's the case. I think it's very easy for authorities to be given powers, and it's very difficult to take them away from them. There's a great article about this that I've completely forgotten. It's a legal article. Let me just find the name of it so you can have it. I'll have to find it. I'll have to send it on later, but it's an article about the history of emergency legislation and how almost no emergency legislation has ever been taken off the statute books, ever. And they all are brought in for a month or 6 months, and they never ever go. And that applies to the Northern Ireland, particularly the Northern Ireland legislation. So internment and various the diplock courts and that sort of thing. They were brought in in emergency powers, and they never ever went away. And they've sort of gone away in part. Anti-terrorism legislation. So post 9/11, the first big sort of test of the Human Rights Act, the anti-terrorism legislation that came in, was meant to be really urgent and temporary, and has never gone. Things like control orders are being brought back with no particular justification. I mean, there's been a couple of very small, and I don't mean that to say they weren't tragic, but small scale terrorist incidents involving lone terrorists, but they're bringing back these very sort of draconian laws. And I think that the police have had a taste for being involved in people's private and personal lives that they haven't ever had. And I think a lot of police really don't like that, but I think this will become something that is less, where people are more used to it and people are less sensitive to it, and that is of concern, because the police should be not knowing what we're doing in our own houses with two people if it's not antisocial or illegal behavior. They shouldn't, so I'm with you, and that's another really important part of the human rights approach, and one that I haven't mentioned, is that emergency laws should be temporary, with the sunset clause, as we call them. I think.
Mark, Adam, can I just ask one last question?
Yeah.
Can I come in? It's very possible, reading at the moment, that COVID has affected the population in an unequal manner, in terms of class or possibly demography. The BAME issue at the moment, obviously, in terms of the ethnic connection to the prevalence of it in Black communities. Is that also a reflection on how, and there are rights issues clearly involved, right, in that, their rights within society? Does that, is that a function or related to the fact that coming into the COVID crisis, that we were not availing our country of full rights across the board? Is there an issue that we brought in that we're going to be shown up on through this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, well, the one thing to say about the Black and Asian susceptibility to COVID-19, that is outside of my expertise, because I think that is a scientific question that has to be answered scientifically. It might be social factors, it might be something to do with nationality, it might be something to do with prevalence of underlying conditions. I don't know, but one thing the government has a duty to do under equalities laws, under human rights laws, is to make sure that its policies are not impacting disproportionately on particular racial groups. And so you can imagine a situation where if you relax the lockdown, you could strongly argue that will have a disproportionate effect on Black and minority ethnic groups, because you are potentially inviting the virus back in. Now, that you may be able to justify that because of the importance to the economy, or you might have measures which of warning particular groups, or of focusing medically on particular groups. I don't know. You might mitigate that. That's one thing, but there are other ways. So I did a podcast on this with Chai Patel from the Joint Council of the Welfare of Immigrants on my Better Human podcast, which you should all listen to. We were talking about the impact of the hostile environment on COVID-19. So the hostile environment is this policy that this government and it started in the late sort of Labour days, and it's this policy of making it very uncomfortable, so uncomfortable for people who are here without legal status that they will leave. That's it in a nutshell. You're creating a hostile environment for them, and you do that by enlisting the landlords to check people's immigration status, employers to act as sort of immigration enforcers where they check people's passports before they give them jobs, and they can be fined or even put in prison if they don't comply with it. Even healthcare professionals, so you charge people for medical care if they don't have status here. You go and enforce that the bills. You make having debts for NHS care a barrier to getting status even after a number of years, those sorts of things. And one of the effects that COVID-19 has had is that it's sort of supercharged that dynamic, because, for example, there are a number of communities, there's a lot of people who live here without legal status, hundreds of thousands, maybe even over 1 million people. And they are, by and large, worried about coming into hospitals or to their GP because A, they might have to pay, and B, they might be shot to the Home Office. And I think the health professionals have generally not played ball with that, but there's still a fear and a sort of a cultural expectation that will happen. And that means that a lot of the effect of COVID-19 may be going under the radar. And because people are frightened to access healthcare, and when you add in the fact that people from Black and minority ethnic communities are particularly susceptible, maybe, it seems they might be, then it's a kind of bit of a toxic brew. So I think that is that is a dynamic which is specific to the UK, which is quite toxic. And I think it's definitely right that that will be a sort of shame on our country